Canto 20. Cal had never met a pope, and now he had met a former one. It was only when they had parted he realized he never got a name. I mean, how many bad popes could there be? Maybe only one or two, surely. He'd figure out which one when he got home. Then he sighed at the thought of home. It didn't feel very home-like anymore. And he wasn't even sure if he wanted to go back. If he was thinking that in the bowels of hell, what would he think when he was beyond the Inferno? Problem? Sophie asked. No, Cal answered. I just don't know whether I want to be an antiques dealer anymore. You probably never did. That was what your grandfather wanted, not you. That didn't help. He wanted to know who he was, and all he seemed to know for sure is who his grandfather was. He thought of himself, really tried really hard. He was something. He'd figure it out when he figured out who that pope was, just not now. They had made it to the next bridge. Looking down, he saw what looked like a circus. Many were moving about or sitting at tables. They were all in outlandish costumes. Then he realized that wasn't even half of them. There were many others that looked like they belonged in an office. They were wearing suits, all incorrectly somehow. Ties were on their heads, arms, or legs, anywhere but their actual neck. Things were on backwards, like suit jackets or pants. Shoes were on the wrong feet. I remember one of the two I dropped off here, Sophie began. She had told a whole church that they were headed towards good times, when in reality, they were headed towards the 2008 stock market crash. It wiped out congregant savings and forced the church to prematurely close. She pointed out, "See? There she is." She was pointing to a tall, lanky woman with long brown hair and a very hippie-ish outfit. He watched as she appeared to be walking aimlessly and then tripped and fell when she stumbled on a rock that was clearly right in front of her. Why did she trip? Is she blind? Of sorts, Sophie answered. She can physically see all of it, but we are all fortune tellers. We all have some inkling of what is to come, even if the only inkling is what is immediately in front of us. Like, I knew we are going to smell something really bad, and I could see the immediate future. We were prepared when it arrived. Any ability to see any future has been taken from these people while they're here. She didn't realize she was going to trip on a rock? Cal asked. Yeah, and in return, she has complete awareness of what was. She can see everything that has happened completely. Cal kept watching the woman as she wept on the ground. That's horrible. Excuse me? There was an anger in her question, and it caught Cal off guard. She had been gracious and understanding until now. This actually sounded slightly perturbed. They're false prophets, Cal. They claim to have God's voice. Then, for their own selfish reasons, they all led innocent people, spiritually blind people, into destruction. Sophie's face melted into sadness. Sorry. It's just when you bring enough people to their level, put there by people who knowingly fought God's message, you don't look at them like they shouldn't be punished. They'll leave eventually too, but first, this must happen. Cal felt tiny next to Sophie's passion. So much so, all he could think to do was nod his head. She continued. We grow up thinking prophets are fortune tellers, and they're not. They're just messengers acting and saying on behalf of God what we're too afraid to say ourselves. Most real prophets are tortured and killed because the people don't like what God has to say. But not them. She motioned around her at the hundreds just in Cal's view. They promise things they couldn't personally give. They draw your aunt and cousins in with promises of a better life. They join a commune in California. Then the snake takes them all to the jungle where the false prophet can do great harm, even to the point of death, where the only sweetness is laced with cyanide. I think this punishment lets them off easy. Cal nodded again, speechless. This sounded too pointed to not be real. I'm sorry, he added. Sophie shook her head and looked at her watch. It was an action he hadn't seen her do since... He tried to remember. Since her death house? Now she jammed her arm back down and looked away. Should we go? He suggested. It doesn't matter, she responded. Anyway, have you noticed we've been moving faster just by taking this in? Trying to rush through is a fool's errand. Cal closed his eyes and bowed his head. He had done it because he couldn't think. He wanted to run through, to get Sophie where she clearly wanted to be so bad. He wanted to remove her pain. He wanted her afterlife to be good. It was in this action he realized he was in a position of prayer. Cal wasn't a prayer. It felt odd to talk to a force he did or didn't know was there. When he'd find himself in these positions, the furthest he'd ever get is, Dear God. Dear God. Who spoke like that anymore? It was like he should conclude it with, Sincerely yours, Cal. Usually those prayers would end with him stopping and shaking it away like a silly idea. Only this time was different. This time felt like he'd never left the conversation. Not when the last word was merely a feeling, a statement of love in the baptismal rivers. This time, he was already in it. Help me, help her, he thought. In any way, please. There was no answer, or none he could perceive. So he opened his eyes and raised his head to see Sophie staring into the pit. Realizing he was looking at her, she asked, Have you ever been haunted by what has not yet happened? Sophie took a very slow breath out. Her voice was hollow. Her eyes revealed her brain was somewhere else. I knew something was going to happen. I was teaching world literature when one of the boys came in from the principal's office, sat next to his friend, and I saw the two of them whisper. Then it happened. She turned her gaze to Cal. They looked resolved. I knew something was going to happen. I just didn't know what. She turned back to the masses. I told my friend, and she told me it was just a look. See? She was a false prophet. Only she'll never be here because she didn't realize that was what she was doing. Every last person here knew what they were doing. That's the difference. When Cal considered what would be really bad sins, he thought of murderers, but never the people who led those being murdered to their fate. That's what these levels had been since getting off Garon. It's been people who had to know the truth and to see a fuse had been lit, and for whatever reason, chose to let it burn. That was the sin that deserved punishment. And apparently, it was for those who did all that in the name of God. Cal shivered even though it wasn't very cold. Can we move on? Sophie looked beyond the bridge and back to Cal. Carefully. I worry about you for the next two. Why? He asked. Because I believe the next one will want you, and the one after will have you.